In this nugget, we're going to demonstrate how we can do granular access control based on App ID. We're going to use Facebook as the example in this scenario. Let's begin. So here in the graphical user interface for the Palo Alto, let's take a look at a few of these application objects. Again, there's more than 2,000 of them. To see those, we're going to click on the Objects tab right here. And then over on the left, we'll simply go down to Applications, referring to application objects. And I'm going to go ahead and use this icon right here to go to the very last page. We can also do some really cool searching up here, but for now, I'm just going to go ahead and go to web browsing. So I'm going back a few pages, and there's web browsing. If we click on web browsing, it'll give us the details of that. So for generic web browsing, we're expecting TCP port 80. And notice this, it doesn't depend on any other applications for this to work, and it also doesn't implicitly use any other application objects. Now, that being said, it would also be nice if we gave our users somewhere in the security policy the ability to do name resolution. So at a bare minimum, it's very likely for our users, we're going to give them web browsing, that application, DNS, that application, and also SSL. So one question that might come up is, holy shnikers, you mean I've got to add 3 different applications every single time I want to give users access to SSL, HTTP, and DNS? And the answer is yes, or we could actually create what's called an application group. So here under Objects, over on the left, we have application groups that we selected, and let's click on Add. This is just creating an application group that identifies a group of applications that we could then use inside of a security policy. So if we know that we're going to use applications such as SSL, in fact, let's do this. So let's call this Basic Internet Group, referring to a group of applications, and let's add SSL, and let's add DNS, and let's add web browsing. And then we'll click on OK. And I want to modify this. I also want to add ping. So we'll add the application of ping, and that would be based on our corporate policy, and we'll click on OK. And then what we could do is we could go back to our policies. So we're here at the Policy tab. We've selected Security on the left, and right now we've got DNS, ping, SSL, and web browsing all as separate applications that we're permitting as part of rule number 1. If we wanted to edit that, we can go ahead and click over here. That's one way of editing the applications that are allowed, or we can cancel that. We can click on the rule itself, and then we can go over to Application, and we can change them here. 6 in one, half a dozen in the other. So if we wanted to delete all these, by selecting them and clicking on delete, we could. And if we click on add, and I type in the word group, I think I had group in our name. There we go. Basic Internet Group. That's the group of applications that we just created. And then we can click on OK. And now under application, let me go ahead and make that a little bit bigger. It shows the application being permitted is Basic Internet Group. And if we use the drop down here regarding Basic Internet Group and select value, or just hover over value, it'll show us the members of that group. So SSL, DNS, web browsing, and ping are all part of that application group that we're now using as part of our policy. So it doesn't really matter too much which way you do it. I just want to make sure you knew you had the option. So of course, we're going to go ahead and commit this. We'll click on commit and click on commit one more time. And then we'll close that and let that finish in the background. Now let's go back to our application objects. So we'll go to the Objects tab. We'll click on the Applications icon on the left, and let's go down to Facebook. I'm going to go down just a few pages to the F's. So here is Facebook. We have Facebook Apps, Facebook Base, Facebook Chat, Facebook File Sharing, etc. If we click on Facebook Base, it'll give us the details about that application object. And notice here that it doesn't depend on anything. So we don't have to explicitly specify another application for Facebook Base to work. But also notice that it implicitly uses SSL and web browsing associated with Facebook-Base. See, in the old days, we would have to explicitly also allow SSL and web browsing applications somewhere in our policy if we wanted Facebook-Base to work. So the implicitly uses feature is really, really cool. Another example I'd like to talk with you about is Facebook Chat. If we click on Facebook Chat and bring up the details for that application object, here we have some dependencies. So it says, hey, this will not work. I need a brick, a row of bricks that includes Facebook-Base and MQTT. And as part of our policy, if we tried to apply this and commit it, it would come up with a warning saying, hey, you know what? There are some dependencies that are not met, which would remind us of those dependencies. So those dependencies have to be permitted or allowed somewhere in our security policy, whether it's in the same exact rule, where we're enabling Facebook chat or somewhere else in our security policy, it has to be allowed. And then implicitly, meaning we don't have to manually specify these applications, the applications of Jabber and web browsing, those are implicitly going to be allowed and used by Facebook-chat. So let's set up some Facebook for our users. And to do that, we're going to go over to Policies. On the left-hand side with Security selected, I'm going to go ahead and take our first rule here, which is rule number 1. It's selected. I'm going to go ahead and disable that rule. So once we commit that to the running configuration, it'll be as if rule number 1 doesn't exist from a permission standpoint. And let's go ahead and add some Facebook access by clicking on Add. And let's name this FB-rule. The source, let's specify as coming from the inside. The source address, let's go ahead and specify our subnet of 10.1.1. For the destination, we'll go ahead and say that traffic is going out the outside zone. And the destination address can be anything. The application, let's go ahead and click on Add. And here's my question. Do you remember what the base application is? I'm sorry. Do you remember what the base application is for Facebook? I just want to drive home that it's Facebook-base. So we'll do a search for that. So there's a whole bunch of Facebook options here. We'll grab Facebook-base. And if we go to service/URL category, we're going to use application-default. So we'll leave that alone. And the action that we want to take is we want to go ahead and allow it. And I'm going to do logging at the start of the session, just because I want to make sure those log messages show up when we attempt to go to Facebook. And I'm also going to do logging at the end. Now, I am going to get some duplicates as far as logging, and that's okay. In a lab environment, as we're starting to set things up, it's nice to see log information and details regarding what traffic is going through the firewall. I also noticed that earlier when I was working with 6.1 and it wasn't yet licensed, that the traffic logs didn't show up. So that may have been a function of the firewall not being licensed. So if you are working in a lab environment and you don't have a license on your firewall, and your traffic logs simply don't show up, you're in good company. You're in good company, because that happened to me too. So here we'll click on OK. And rules are processed from top to bottom. So rule 2 will be checked first, and then rule 3. And then there's an implicit deny if no rule is met. So what I like to do, especially for a lab environment, is let's create an additional rule that denies everything. And the benefit of that is we can actually set up logging on that as well to see what's being denied. So instead of having an implicit deny at the end, we'll have an explicit deny and logging. So let's create an additional deny rule. And let's name it explicit deny. That way when we see it, we'll know, oh, that's exactly the rule that killed it. And regarding source, it can be any. Destination can be any. Application can be any. Service category, application default, and actions is to deny. So let's go ahead and do a deny. And what the heck, let's also throw in a reset both client and server. So if it's TCP based, both sides are going to get a TCP reset being sent or initiated from the Palo Alto. And we'll say log at session start here as well. And then we'll click on OK. We can also move these around. If we wanted to take rule number 4 and we wanted to move it up, we could simply highlight it and then down here select move, and then move to top, move up, move down, and so forth. Or you can just drag and drop it. So if we want that to be our first rule, which would be a huge problem because it's matching all traffic anywhere, it's going to kill it. Because it's in position number 1, our other rules would never have a chance to be met. So let's go ahead and drag this down, and we'll put it at the very bottom here. The explicit deny with logging enabled. And with that, we'll click on commit and commit one more time. And then we'll click on close and let that finish in the background. Next, let's go over to Bob's computer right here. And from this computer, let's just verify that we can go out to Facebook. Because we should have basic functionality and basic access to Facebook, even though we won't have the features of chat and video and so forth, because those are separate application objects that we have not yet permitted. And it just occurred to me right now that this is not going to work yet because we don't have a security policy that's allowing DNS. So we're going to, before we test it, let's go back and modify our security policy and add DNS resolution for Bob. And that'll give him the chance to do name resolution from Facebook to an IP address so we can actually reach the Facebook servers. So back in the graphical user interface, we'll go ahead and let's take the Facebook rule right here. And let's just click on application. We have Facebook-base there. We'll add, and let's add DNS. And that'll save us some frustration. All right, and we'll click OK. and we'll commit that as well. Looking good. So let's go to Bob's machine and do some testing. All right, so let's bring in Bob's computer. Now, one of the challenges when working in a lab environment, trying to identify, okay, what's happening, what's being allowed, what's not being allowed, is that when we bring up applications, for example, a browser on the local computer, there's going to be a lot of default stuff happening in the background, a lot of DNS activity, a lot of Google Apps activity. So one option might be this. If you're using Chrome, you could go ahead and launch a new incognito window, which shouldn't be launching a whole bunch of stuff in the background. And I'm going to leave that open. I'm going to kill the background window there. So we just have this one incognito window open. And then I'm also going to do this. Let's also go back to the Palo Alto firewall and go under Device. Over here on the left, there's an option for log settings. Let's click on that. And then there's an option here for, under Manage Logs, there's an option to clear traffic logs. So just as a nice kind of fresh starting point, let's go ahead and clear traffic logs. And that way we can have a fairly comfortable assumption that any log information we're looking at is current. Now there also will be timestamps on those logs. But once again, it's easier in a lab environment to clean them out so you can have kind of a nice fresh look at the traffic logs. So those logs have been deleted. Let's go back to Bob's computer and let's go ahead and give Facebook a shot. So we'll go to facebook.com. Now that looks good. Now notice, even though I didn't put in HTTPS, I did get redirected to HTTPS. And then we could go ahead and log in. So I'll go ahead and do that. Let me log in with my username and password, and we'll click on Login. So here's my Facebook page for Keith Barker Networking. There's a few people who check that out from time to time, which is great. It's a great way to keep in touch with me if you'd like. And notice that it seems to be working. So the DNS application in our policy allowed DNS resolution to happen, and the Facebook-base application, which implicitly is using web-browsing and SSL, is allowing this Facebook page to come up. Now, one thing I'd like you to notice, though, is if we go over here to chat and I expand that, it's showing right here that there's a problem, unable to chat. Now, on the Palo Alto firewall, if we wanted to look at that traffic regarding what's happening, what's been permitted, what's been denied, we'd go back to the Palo Alto firewall. We would click on the Monitor tab. That's the third tab from the left right here. And then under Logs, we would select Traffic, and that's going to show us our traffic log. And if we want to see the latest and greatest information, you might want to just make sure we click on the refresh icon right here to refresh this page to make sure we're seeing the latest information. I'm also going to go ahead and use the drop down and select Adjust Columns to kind of optimize the space. I'm also going to select the drop down and go to Columns and take off a few columns just for the display, and that'll be enough. That way we can see everything we need to right here. So right here is showing us that we have 10 pages of logs, and that's since we did the clearing. We could also specify right here as far as how many events do we want to see per page. I'm going to say 100. So now with 100 selected, we have 5 pages. So we have about 500 entries. We also have an option here to resolve host name, and that's the Palo Alto doing a reverse lookup, taking an IP address and then asking DNS what's the name associated with this. So if we go to the very first page, which is the oldest entry, I'm going to go to page number 5. And I am going to add back on to the columns the receive time. So these timestamps are based on the Palo Alto, and the latest and greatest ones are placed at the top. So here we have our first initial log after our clearing. And here in the rule column, it's saying the rule that caught it. So the explicit deny that we created basically killed most of the traffic that we see here. So here we have FB-rule, which included the DNS application. So that allowed a DNS request from our browser. Then we have a whole bunch of other denies based on our explicit deny, which is fantastic, so we can know what's happening. And we can continue to scroll up and look through all these. And here we have Facebook base, which is allowing a query. So our Facebook rule, which included Facebook base, allowed that connection between Bob's computer and the Facebook server. And look at this one. Here we have an SSL connection on port 443 that's being used as part of Facebook-base, that application, which implicitly allows SSL. And there's so much detail in here, it's fun to read through. It's like a novel. And it's especially helpful when we're trying to identify why isn't an application working. For example, if we go through here far enough, let's go to page 2. And as we scroll through this list, check this out. Here we have Facebook chat that was denied. So the app ID identified the fact that we were trying to use Facebook-chat, and it got caught by our rule called explicit-deny. And that's because we didn't have a permit earlier inside of our security policy that said permit the application of Facebook-chat. So it identified it, said, sorry, it's not permitted. And we're seeing this in our logs because we have that explicit deny present as a rule, and we're doing logging on it. So here's my question for you. If you and I decide that we do want to allow Bob to use Facebook-chat, how do we go about allowing that? Think about that for a moment. Now, if you're saying, Keith, we just add that as an application to the security policy and allow it, you'd be absolutely correct. Let's do it. Let's click on Policies. Over on the left, we'll select Security. And we could either edit this Facebook rule or we could add a new rule. So if we wanted to, we could click on the rule here and edit it, or we could click on the applications in this rule, and that would allow us also to add another application. So let's click on Add, and we'll type in Face, and we want Facebook-chat right here, and we'll click on OK. Now, I seem to recall something that we saw about the Facebook chat application. Didn't it have like some dependencies? So what we might want to do is we might want to go take a look at the details for Facebook-chat and make sure that we're also including any dependencies that are not implicitly used by that application. So there's a couple of ways that we could find out those dependencies. We could go to the object and take a look at the details for that object, or we could hover over Facebook-chat, and from the drop-down arrow just to the right of Facebook-chat, we could select Value. And as we hover over that, it's going to tell us that it does depend on Facebook base, which we already have. It also depends on MQTT. So if we want Facebook-chat to work, we also need to include MQTT as being an allowed application. So because we know that right here, let's go ahead and simply click on the application section for that rule. We'll click on Add. We'll type in MQTT. And there it is. And we'll click on OK. If we want more details on MQTT, we could go to the Object section and take a detailed look at that object. Or right here, we could also use the drop-down, hover over Value, and it would tell us about it. In my best moderator's voice, MQTT stands for Message Queue Telemetry Transport. It is a blah, 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 blah. It also lists near the bottom there the standard ports associated with this application. So because we need it for Facebook chat to work, we're going to include it. And then we'll click on Commit and commit again, and then we'll go ahead and let that process in the background. The other option that we have is going to Palo Alto's website. We can go to a website called applepedia.paloaltonetworks.com. And let me show you that URL right here. applepedia.paloaltonetworks.com. There's also an application for mobile devices, for example, an iOS device, where you can look up the details for the application objects to see them on your mobile phone. Now, one thing I noticed is that if you want the latest and greatest information regarding an application, getting it directly from your Palo Alto firewall is the best way to do it. Because the context-sensitive help and all the details that it's showing you when you look at it live in a graphical user interface is likely the most accurate and updated information regarding something like an application object. For example, here on the website, if we did a search for Facebook, let's type in face and press enter, and then we scroll down to the Facebook section. Here, if we go to Facebook-base, you'll notice that Facebook-base says it depends on applications. Now, that's good and bad news that this information is here. It's good because we're aware of it, but it's a little bit bad because the version 7 of the Palo Alto firewall implicitly uses SSL and web browsing. So we don't have to specifically say web browsing and SSL if our customers are just going to be using Facebook. So once again, for the latest and greatest details on whether it's dependent or implied, use the graphical user interface on the Palo Alto itself to get the latest and greatest information about a specific object. So back at the Palo Alto firewall, we'll click on Tasks just to make sure that our commit was successful, which it was. Let's go back to Bob's computer. And actually, before we do that, let's go back to Device. And on the left, we'll select Log Settings. And let me clear those traffic logs again. Because there's also my Windows 10 PC, as you know, is making a whole bunch of requests, looking for updates and all other kinds of things that it does, which are filling up the logs with noise as well. So we'll click on Yes to clear the logs. And then let's go to Bob's computer. We'll launch a browser. Because I just brought up this default homepage, there's very likely, and we can see them in the logs, there's very likely going to be a boatload of Google-related applications and services that are being denied because we didn't identify any type of Google base or Google apps to be allowed through the firewall. That's okay. So let's go to Facebook. And specifically, I'm going to go down to my Keith Barker networking page. So over here in my chat, I no longer have a message about chat not working. Let me click on one of my contacts I can chat with. So I'm going to say this is a test that should work. Just a test. Have a good day. That way that person doesn't need to reply. I'll press enter. And that one actually made it through. Or assuming the Facebook network is functioning, that should make it through. It's not my firewall that's going to be denying that. And to verify that the Facebook chat is working and able to be forwarded by the firewall, we can go back to the firewall, go over to Monitor. On the left-hand side under Logs, select Traffic, which should refresh this page. And if not, you can go ahead and click on the refresh icon just for good measure. And then we can scroll down looking for the Facebook chat. And I see it right here. So we have Facebook-chat being allowed based on this rule. And if we click on this button right here, the Palo Alto will take those IP addresses that it has in these logs and attempt to do a reverse lookup to show us the names associated with those IP addresses. In this nugget, we've demonstrated how to implement granular access control based on the applications that we want to allow using Facebook as an example. I'm glad you joined me for this nugget. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.